When I was a boy, a little boy, they taught me that the Pygmies were savage people just because they live in the forest, which isn't true. The Pygmies have invented a fabulous musical technique or instrumental technique.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back, or nice meeting you. I am a real person. I know there's a lot of AI on these types of videos, so hit that like button if you like real people talking about real people groups and stuff. I really do get comments asking if I'm AI just about every single video. But for this one, we're looking at the Pygmy people. These people give us a view into how most people all across the planet were likely living all the way up until only about 10,000 years ago. The most interesting aspects to me were their religious worldview. Of course, that's the label we would give it. To them, it just comes as instinctual. It's just natural to view the world with having other spiritual forces. You'll see a theme that's been constant throughout a bunch of my other videos, that you can have a diffusion of technology without major genetic change. Of course, we'll also get into their height, but that's just kind of the most superficial thing about them. It's really how they live, which is so interesting. And be sure to check out the links down below for this video I'm using to get all these clips from. It really is incredible. If you're interested in this, you'll definitely love that video. My video is pulling from a ton of different published papers to give you a complete sort of history of these people and up to the modern day, but that documentary is amazing for seeing how they're living today. I hope you enjoy it. Comment any questions you have down below if there are some corrections or things you want to add. But let's get into it. Deep in the rainforest of Central Africa, there are indigenous hunter-gatherer peoples traditionally known as Pygmies, or now, which is more common in academia, the Central African forest foragers. These groups, including the Aka and Baka of the west, the Mbuti of the east, and the widely scattered Twa of the south, are famed for their short stature, with adult men averaging under 5 feet tall, and having rich, forest-centered cultures. Numbering only roughly 500,000 to maybe 900,000 people today, they represent some of the last modern societies maintaining a predominantly hunter-gatherer lifestyle in these equatorial rainforests. Despite living far apart and speaking different languages, all Central African Pygmy groups share striking similarities in their way of life. From net hunting and wild yam gathering to complex music and spiritual traditions centered on the forest. So we're going to explore everything that science currently knows about these forest people, drawing on the latest research, everything coming from 2022 to 2025, from branches like genetics, archaeology, linguistics, and anthropology. And let's just get this out of the way. Some consider the term pygmy controversial. It originated from Greek mythology. Pygmy means a cubit, being associated with the smallest unit of measure you could think of, and so it was used to just mean that they were short. It was applied by 19th century explorers to describe Africa's short-statured hunter-gatherers, and some think it is pejorative, preferring names like Baaka for the Aka and Baka groups, the Mbuti or Batwa, and again in research papers you'll often see Central African hunter-gatherers, or forest foragers. But because there is no single replacement term that fully encompasses the diversity of these people, in other words, you shouldn't call all of them Baaka, and not all hunter-gatherers in this area are this short, the term pygmy still remains in common use for this cultural grouping even in scientific literature, because we mean those short-statured hunter-gatherers in Central Africa in the rainforests. So when talking about these people as a whole, I'll use pygmy, and when talking about specifics like the Baaka or Mbuti or Batwa, I'll use those more specific names. So let's get into the genetics. Modern genetic studies reveal that Central African Pygmy populations are not recent offshoots of their farming neighbors, but they bear the imprint of an exceptionally ancient lineage of humans. Genomic analysis indicate that these forest hunter-gatherers diverged from other African populations very early in human prehistory, likely around 200,000 years ago. This would make their ancestry among the oldest known in our species, second only to the South African hunter-gatherers, the group that gave rise to the Khoisan people, which I did a whole video on them already, and be on the lookout for a couple more videos on these people soon. But in other words, the ancestors of today's Aka, Baka, Mbuti, and Twa are likely part of some of the first modern human populations to settle in Central Africa's tropical forests. There's a growing body of evidence suggesting that Central Africa had been continuously occupied by hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years, now it's seeming like hundreds of thousands of years, despite all the dramatic climate change and ecological changes, recent genetic, archaeological, and paleoenvironmental research points to continuous human presence in the Congo Basin, which stretches back to at least 120,000 years ago. Stone tool evidence has long been proof of at least the Middle Stone Age, which was over 30,000 years ago, and that's all long before farming arrived. It's long before farming was known to be invented anywhere on the planet, with most estimates having that around 10,000 years ago. These early hunter-gatherers likely adapted to cyclical rainforest expansions and contractions over the millennia. There's a 2022 study that shows that the ecological features of the Congo Basin showed that we can expect that this area would have sustained human life for 120,000 years ago, and that it could support intergroup connectivity. In other words, it never completely dies out, or becomes so isolated that they become like little rainforest islands spread across Africa. Even in the most scarce times when these rainforests might have shrunk, there was still at least of a connected Congo Basin rainforest that these groups could have been in contact with each other. But of course, like we've seen in North Africa, and even much more modern history, think ancient Europe, the Middle East, and India, just because these people are in contact, it doesn't mean that they don't become genetically distinct. Within the Pygmy people themselves, genetics show us something deeper, that Western groups like the Aka and Baka of Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and Gabon, and the Eastern groups like the Mbuti of the DRC's Ituri forests, they all separated from each other long ago. DNA evidence suggests an east-west split around 20,000 years before present, likely during the last glacial maximum, when rainforest areas shrank into pockets. In other words, at this time, we are seeing it becoming more like separated rainforest islands. This means that Western Mabenga and Eastern Mbuti Pygmy populations have been evolving largely independently since the late Pleistocene, even though they share certain physical traits and lifestyles. So around 180,000 years of this Pygmy development, but then around 20,000 years we have distinctions into these different groups. One really interesting finding, and something that you'll see is consistent with all the other videos I've done so far, on all kinds of phenotypes from light skin to light hair, the hallmark short stature or Pygmy phenotype evolved via different genetic pathways in different groups, showing a case of divergent evolution. One study showed that growth patterns of Baka children were born a normal size, but experience a dramatic slowdown in growth in early infancy, whereas East African Pygmy groups have different growth trajectories. Natural selection found multiple ways to produce smaller adult body sizes, and likely this is an adaptation to living in these smaller rainforest areas. This independent evolution is supported by genomic scans. Western and Eastern Pygmies do not share identical short stature genes. Instead, each has unique sets of gene variants affecting height that were favored by these changing environments. The Pygmy trait may be conferring advantages like efficient thermoregulation in hot, humid forests and the ability to thrive on limited nutrition. I'll get more into those theories later, but if you watch the Khoisan video, remember that they were actually pretty short too, with men on average only being 5 feet 3 inches. That's not that far off from the Pygmy, where they just put the cutoff at being below 4 foot 11. And all the recent genetic research debunks the outdated notion that these people were just stunted offshoots of neighboring tribes. Kind of like the theory that all lighter-skinned people around the world were descended from some albino tribe that left Africa. It isn't like the Pygmy groups were just like really short, exiled people that all kind of condensed in the rainforests. In genome-wide analyses, Central African Pygmies emerge as a distinct genetic cluster, separate from the surrounding Bantu and Sudanic-speaking farming populations. They carry many unique or highly diverged DNA lineages not found in their neighbors. Geneticists often group Africa's indigenous peoples into 4 major ancestral clusters: Khoisan, the Southern African hunter-gatherers; Pygmy, Central African forest hunter-gatherers; General West/Central African farmers; and Nilotic/East African groups. The Pygmy groups have retained alleles or gene variants that trace back to very ancient humans, contributing to the extraordinary genetic diversity of the African continent. Like how their mitochondrial DNA is often haplogroup L1, one of the oldest branches of the human family tree. Some deep segments of Pygmy genomes are so divergent that scientists believe they may be remnants of interbreeding with an archaic hominin population, a mysterious group of ancient hominins who separated from what would become the Homo sapien lineage. Studies in the 2010s first reported evidence that Central African Pygmies and some West African populations carry a small proportion of genetic material that doesn't match any known modern human group, hinting at a ghost, archaic ancestor within Africa. Of course, newer details are always coming out on this, But it's just to point out that this archaic admixture signals just how ancient and unique the heritage of these hunter-gatherers are, stretching back to nearly the dawn of the Homo sapien species. If you saw my video on the Takakori, the ancestral North African group, remember that they are related to the people of Taffaralt over in Morocco. And when we were studying the Taffaralt people, they assigned this label of ghost archaic ancestor to them too, but this did end up being Homo sapiens, but just of such an ancient lineage that they didn't know what it was. You could see the effects of an unknown hominin group, it's just that it happened to be a Homo sapien group, with the Takakori samples finally showing that this was a unique ancestral group in North Africa. So again, ghost archaic ancestor does not necessarily mean not Homo sapien. And though deeply distinct, Pygmy peoples have never lived in total isolation. Their history includes ongoing interactions and mixing with neighboring communities, both other hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists. Perhaps the most significant event was the Bantu expansion, the great migration of farming peoples out of West Central Africa, beginning around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. As iron-working Bantu tribes spread throughout the rainforests with their crops and livestock, they didn't simply replace the indigenous foragers. Instead, the two populations developed a symbiotic relationship. The Bantu needed the foragers' forest skills and trading goods, like bushmeat, honey, and medicinal plants, while the foragers obtained iron tools, cultivated starches, and other goods from the Bantu farmers. This long partnership led to significant genetic admixture over time. DNA studies show that most contemporary Pygmy people have some ancestry from Bantu or other farming groups, and vice versa. One recent genomic study found that Western Pygmy groups, like the Baaka, have on average about 30% DNA that came from farming populations only over the past few thousand years, while Eastern Mbuti have around 10% farmer ancestry. The percentages vary by location. Some individuals and groups remain closer to the pure hunter-gatherer heritage, while others, especially the Twa of the Great Lakes region, have much higher admixture due to intermarriage with farming communities over the centuries. And the many Bantu-speaking villagers living near the forests carry small segments of ancient Pygmy DNA in their genome. The farther a farming group is from the forest core, the less Pygmy ancestry they tend to have, forming a genetic gradient that matches up with the geography. These findings make it clear that Pygmies and their farming neighbors have coexisted and exchanged genes for millennia, even as they mostly maintain distinct identities. In many areas, a patron-client dynamic developed. Farming villages adopted a band of foragers in a mutually beneficial, even if critiqued as an unequal, relationship. And it does make me wonder if this was a similar dynamic to Homo sapien groups that have admixture from Denisovan and Neanderthal. Not a ton, nowhere near 50% of a genome, but people that live near them, where the territories of these two people met, that's where you see some of this mixing of the genes. And it's even a similar story to what we see with, say, the Romans in Europe. One group can say that they control a vast area, but the local traditions and even most of their genome stays the same. There's an exchange of tech and some exchange of genes. Now, all surviving Pygmy groups today speak languages that are borrowed from non-Pygmies, which also points to those like the Bantu being the more powerful group. The Aka and other Western groups now speak variants of Bantu languages, while the Baka speak an Ubangian language, and the Mbuti speak dialects of either neighboring Bantu or Central Sudanic languages. Wherever we look on the globe, the farming people just keep snowballing advantages, eventually having far better tech, a more complex culture, and they expand out, forever altering the people they come in contact with. The original Pygmy languages have been lost. No isolated ancestral language survives, but interestingly, the researchers can detect ancient linguistic footprints, specialized words that only exist among the forest people and not in the farmer's vocabulary. Like in Aka, Baka, and Mbuti groups, separated by hundreds of miles, they all use similar words for certain musical instruments and forest concepts that do not appear in the Bantu or Mbangian tongues. This suggests these terms descended from an earlier hunter-gatherer language family, preserved through oral tradition, even as the group switched to new languages. Pygmy groups had unique conceptions of the forest, a sort of philosophy or worldview, and tools that they invented, so the foreign groups coming in did not have words for these, and so we can tell what was uniquely created by the Pygmies, in terms of their abstract worldview and certain inventions. The legacy of admixture is also visible in the Twa, or Batwa Pygmy groups, who live around the Great Lakes region of Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. The Twa are often semi-sedentary and many have intermarried with Bantu agriculturalists over the last 1 to 2 millennia. Many have been pushed out of the forest into farmer villages, and they have a more mixed gene pool and sometimes a somewhat taller stature. Genetic studies confirm that Batwa share the ancient forest lineage with other Pygmies, but also carry significant DNA from neighboring peoples. And this matches up with their own oral histories, which say that they were gradually assimilated or displaced by the expansion of farming and cattle herding cultures in the Great Lakes. But despite this, the Batwa have retained distinct cultural elements like pottery traditions and dance, which are still unique and show that they were a separate indigenous people. And it wasn't just farmer-forager mixing, there's evidence that different Pygmy groups themselves exchanged people and genes in the past. Recent genetic studies show hunter-gatherer populations across Central Africa were interconnected, forming a network rather than being completely isolated islands. Even after the Bantu arrival, this interconnectivity continued. Studies have found identical by descent genetic fragments shared between geographically distant Pygmy groups, pointing to intermarriage or common ancestry within the last few thousand years across these vast distances. And this research, which integrated genetics with culture, showed that the most ancient portions of Pygmy genomes correlated strongly with the distribution of certain musical instruments in their culture. The implication is that the groups separated by vast distances were in contact long ago, exchanging spouses and knowledge, thus spreading genes and memes, physical items, concepts, and culture that is spreading across Pygmy groups before farming even entered the picture. And so there used to be this view that the Pygmy were the result of just hiding from these more recent farming groups. And like how one of the researchers put it, quote, "These people should no longer be seen as encapsulated groups recently marginalized into the forest, but as populations with a central role in understanding our modern human origins." But of course, one of the most interesting questions is why they evolved such short statures and other distinctive physical traits. Their small, agile bodies, with adult males being around 4'11", have long been thought to be adaptations to life in tropical rainforests. But what specific pressures led to this trait? There are a number of hypotheses, but the latest genetic evidence is our best tool. They are confirming things like the life history adaptation theory, which goes that in rainforests, getting enough calories, especially protein, is challenging, and diseases like malaria are rampant. So humans evolved to mature faster and reproduce earlier, at the expense of attaining large body size. Essentially, staying small might allow a woman to reach childbearing age sooner, ensuring at least some offspring in a harsh environment where few live long. Shorter growth could be the genetic trade-off that enables this accelerated schedule, and indeed, researchers have found changes in the growth hormone/IGF axis in Pygmy populations, pointing towards this endocrine basis for reduced growth. Another factor might be thermoregulation and mobility in the dense jungle. Just like we saw with the Khoisan, smaller bodies dissipate heat more efficiently in hot, humid climates. The surface area to volume ratio is higher, which helps prevent overheating. They also require less total food intake, a definite advantage when you're trekking miles a day to forage. In entangled forest undergrowth, a compact physique could be beneficial for moving swiftly, climbing trees for honey, or hiding from predators. If there was some random mutation that led to some giant guy stumbling around the rainforest, there was no environmental pressure to make this advantageous. Some anthropologists liken these rainforest ecosystems to an island environment where limited resources favor a form of insular dwarfism, a phenomenon seen in many animal species. Large species that get isolated on islands tend to shrink. And so while it's not the same exact thing, it's a very similar dynamic at work. Dietary factors have also been examined. Rainforest diets can be deficient in certain nutrients like protein, calcium, iodine, and salt compared to most farming diets, and lower calcium and vitamin D, due to the limited sunlight under the canopy, might stunt bone growth over generations. Chronic iodine deficiency is known to impair growth and thyroid function, and interestingly, Pygmy populations in different parts of the world, in Africa and Asia, all have low iodine levels. Evidence that this short stature could be a convergent response to iodine-poor environments. But importantly, these environmental factors alone do not fully explain the genetic hardwiring of the Pygmy phenotype. After all, the neighboring farmer groups in the same regions do not become equally small even if malnourished. And so there's something genetically different about them that is being naturally selected for by their environment. Recent genomic scans point to specific gene variants under positive selection in African Pygmies, genes related to growth, metabolism, and immune function. Genes in growth hormone signaling pathways show unique mutations or unique expression patterns in pygmies, which all work to dampen the body's growth response. And genes related to immune response are also under selection, which makes sense after resisting rainforest diseases like tuberculosis, T-cell leukemia virus, or just countless parasites. This would be critical for survival. Adaptations for a high infection environment could indirectly affect growth as well, because there's energy trade-offs between immunity and body size. Another study found evidence that the pygmy phenotype likely arose via adaptive evolution multiple times within Africa, meaning nature experimented more than once with the formula for these small forest-adapted humans, given that it was beneficial in those contexts. This aligns with observations that even outside Africa, short-statured hunter-gatherers exist in Southeast Asia, the so-called Negrito peoples, and there are other examples, each with their own evolutionary history. So like we saw with the genes for the lightening of skin color, it happens via different genes in different places, but often as a result of the same evolutionary pressures. And so we don't have a single tidy answer. It's clear that the pygmy stature is an evolutionary response to rainforest life, shaped by a mix of ecological pressures, favoring early reproduction over prolonged growth, having a body that can be easily maintained, fight off diseases, and navigate their environment. And now moving beyond their biology, the Central African pygmies have a cultural heritage as ancient and resilient as their genes. Their lifestyles today still reflect core traditions of a nomadic or semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer existence, albeit it is increasingly influenced by the outside world. Traditionally, pygmy groups survive by harvesting the bounty of the rainforest. Men, women, and often children participate in hunting for wild game, using methods adapted to dense jungle terrain. One hallmark is communal net hunting. Groups of men and women will spread large nets crafted from forest vines or cord that they traded for, spreading it in a wide circle through the underbrush, and then they'll drive animals toward that mesh. Whatever tangles, like duikers, which are small forest antelope, wild pigs, monkeys, and even porcupines, they are then speared, cooked, and shared. This cooperative technique is especially practiced by the Aka and Mbuti. In the Ituri forest, Mbuti families famously organize enormous net hunts involving dozens of people beating the bushes and shouting to flush out prey into nets, often leading to great success and a deepening of their communal bonds. Other times, bow and arrow hunting is used, often with poison-tipped arrows from monkeys or birds high up in the canopy. The Baka are known for their skill with crossbows and spears, particularly for hunting larger game like forest hogs. Solo hunting with crossbow or spears is more common during the dry season or when pursuing specific animals. And some even use spring snares and pit traps, placing them alongside animal paths. Foraging complements hunting. Wild yams, berries, fruits, nuts, mushrooms, and other plant foods are gathered by women and children who have an encyclopedic knowledge of edible species. A staple across many groups is the wild yam, often found by following the above-ground vine to unearth the tuber. And honey is another treasured resource. Pygmies are avid honey hunters, braving bee stings to collect honey from hollow trees, sometimes with the help of the greater honey guide bird, which leads them to the hives. The Baka in particular are renowned as expert honey collectors, scaling tall trees to reach hives and using smoke to calm the bees. Honey is not only food, but features in rituals and as a trade item. Fishing is practiced by groups near rivers or lakes. Some, like certain Batwa communities, became specialized fishermen, like catching fish in Lake Kivu with baskets. And while true farming was not traditionally part of pygmy life, most groups today do some trading or bartering with villages to obtain farm starches, like cassava and plantains, and they are partially reliant on these traded foods. No pygmy group now lives entirely deep in the forest, without some access to cultivated foods. For thousands of years now, there's been a degree of interaction with the outside, to a greater or lesser extent in different areas. Now, like most of the earliest groups, they are egalitarian and cooperative in nature. Unlike many farming societies, hunter-gatherers usually share their food with the group. A successful hunt is distributed so that even families who caught nothing this time do receive a portion, because there is an understanding that luck plays such a big role. And it's often said that in a Baaka camp, they all have feast or famine together. Leadership structures in camps are loose and based on respect or consensus, rather than some sort of formal hierarchy. Anthropologists have long highlighted pygmy societies as examples of egalitarian social organization. Decisions are made by discussions, and there are no chiefs or law enforcement. Though even here, there is some male dominance when it comes to decision making, though not as distinct as what you start to see with farming cultures. But there is one thing about the Aka of the Western Congo and Central African Republic regions, where men show high levels of childcare, being known for allowing babies to suckle on their nipples in order to calm them. As babies aren't always using it to get milk, it becomes a way to self-soothe. And so no rigid governmental hierarchy, distinct law enforcement branches or anything like that. Everything from hunting to decision-making is mostly done by agreements from the adults of the tribe. Now, central to their life is music and dance, not just as entertainment, but as a social glue and spiritual expression. In the evening, around campfires under towering trees, the forest people perform complex, polyphonic songs, really unlike any other music on Earth. The Aka Mbuti polyphonic singing, with its yodeling and counterpoint, has been a fascination of ethnomusicologists for decades. And these songs often accompany dance or rituals that can last all night. Music is deeply tied to spiritual beliefs, and many songs are offered to the forest itself, which Pygmies revere as a living entity or sort of deity. The Mbuti have the famous Molimo ceremony, in which they sing through a trumpet to wake the forest, essentially a prayer to the forest spirit to try and restore harmony and avoid misfortune. The forest is seen as benevolent, but sometimes it's just asleep. And so the songs are a way to communicate and ensure that the forest, referred to both as mother and father, they want to make sure that they're aware of them and happy with them. This spiritual worldview, that the forest is alive with some sort of centralized, personalized identity, and as both a provider and protector, this concept is shared across all the Pygmy groups. The Baaka also have dance ceremonies involving forest spirits, called jingi, where men don raffia costumes and embody friendly forest entities during communal dances. It's both a religious event and a communal party, all meant to reinforce social bonds. And again, to stress that this culture appears to be pan-Pygmy, or across all these different groups, and so it's thought to have great antiquity. Like those words that have stayed even after the Bantu expansions, these elements of their culture must have been original to them. Things like the Enzi musical bow, or the Nagambi harp, specific terms that are strongly correlated with the oldest, most deeply rooted genetic lineages among the hunter-gatherers. The word Nekbaidi means a unique two-stringed musical bow played by women, and is found among both the Ifi of the eastern Congo and the Aka and Baka of the western regions, groups that are over 2,000 kilometers apart. And yet the terms for those instruments are absent from all neighboring farmer cultures. There's also the Ngombe, a type of harp used by the Baka, Aka, and even some Batwa, but not by the Bantu. And so all this gives us a glimpse at the most ancient of Pygmy culture, which span this entire rainforest region. And so the music, the instruments, the costumes, and the sort of religious worldview that they have about the forest, all being shared across these people shows up in everyday life, things from celebrations, hunting, marriage rituals, healing ceremonies, and rites of passage. One famous example among the Baka is the Lili, or a Jingi, a dance where a powerful forest spirit, often represented by a costumed dancer, comes to visit their camp. An event both feared and revered, especially by women and children. The Aka have a well-known elephant hunting dance that ritually enacts the hunt of an elephant, even though today elephants are rarely hunted due to scarcity and conservation laws. The Mbuti Molimo and Eligma, which are girls' initiation ceremonies, were famously documented by the anthropologist Colin Turnbull in the 1950s. And this shows a worldview where the forest itself is the ultimate source of morality and well-being. And what's really interesting is that they have myths to explain their own short stature, as they came in contact with other larger people. Some say God made them short so that they could move easily in the forest, which of course matches with the modern science, but others have trickster tales about how they lost their height, and even legends about first contact with villagers. Many Pygmy groups have stories about how in ancient times they taught the farmers how to hunt, or were the ones that gave them fire, showing that they have a pride in their sense of being the masters of this area. As you could see how that could get lost in translation, as the farmer groups would have obviously known how to make fire themselves, but maybe making it in the jungle was far more difficult. So in summary, the Central African Pygmy groups have a unique place in the human saga. Genetically, they are distinct, carrying some of the deepest branches of our species' family tree, and even echoes of archaic ancestors. Culturally, they show how rich and enduring a non-agricultural way of life can be. Their music, oral traditions, and social norms are probably how most ancient hunter-gatherers once lived, what human life looked like across the world for hundreds of thousands of years. And far from being isolated primitives that were forced into the jungles, they had been adapting to them for thousands of years, shaping their minds and bodies, while being connected in continent-spanning networks, swapping songs and spouses across the jungle in a way that sustained their diversity for millennia. Ongoing research from high-tech labs to field ethnography continue to uncover new aspects of how pygmy populations became genetically and culturally distinct. We now understand that their divergence dates back to the Stone Age, and their short stature is an adaptive trait honed by natural selection. There's admixture events with archaic humans and then later incoming farmers, and it all leaves traces in their DNA, but they're still distinct enough to give us this pass into the early L1 human haplogroup history. Many advocate groups on the behalf of the Aka, Baka, Mbuti, and Twa point out that they are being marginalized in their countries, really by the descendants of the Bantu. As like I said, the story of farmer domination seems to be consistent throughout human history across the entire planet. And while I think the farmer civilizations and its consequences are still ultimately and obviously the only hope for humanity, it's important and fascinating to try and understand people like the pygmy, and their intuitive spiritualization of their environment. I think that's the deepest and most profound thing that we can gain from them. Whether it's God as the forest or as the entire universe, these people show us that this way of viewing reality has just been obvious to us, been a core of humanity since the beginning. Thanks for watching. Please hit that like button. It really does help a lot. And I'll see you in the next one.